The sound of heavy machinery echoed through Peterson Manufacturing at 2:47 a.m., but billionaire CEO David Peterson stopped dead in his tracks when he heard something else entirely, heartbroken sobbing coming from the janitor's closet. David had entered his own factory disguised as Jake Martinez, a desperate temp worker. Nobody knew who he really was. Not the security guard who barely looked at his fake ID. Not the supervisor who handed him a hard it and safety vest, not even the foreman who mumbled about another temp who won't last the week. But what David discovered behind that closet door would expose a web of corruption so deep, so systematic, that it would shake the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his company. The person crying behind that door held the key to the most shocking betrayal of his career. Stay with me, because what happens next will change how you think about corporate leadership forever. David Peterson had built Peterson Manufacturing from a small machine shop into a billion-dollar operation employing over 3,000 people across 5 states. But lately, something had been eating at him. The quarterly reports showed declining worker satisfaction scores, increasing accident rates, and a turnover rate that had doubled in the past year. His board of directors insisted everything was normal. It's just the modern workforce, they said. People don't have loyalty anymore. They job hop for 50 cents more an hour, but David couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. The numbers didn't add up. How could a company with record profits have workers leaving in droves? How could efficiency be up while satisfaction was down? How could safety costs be decreasing while accident reports were increasing? So David did something no CEO had ever done in the company's 40-year history. He created a false identity and decided to see his company through the eyes of the people who actually built his products. Meet Jake Martinez, 34 years old, recently laid off from construction work, desperately needing a job to support his sick mother. The fake backstory was perfect, exactly the kind of worker his factory hired by the dozens every week. At 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night, David walked through the employee entrance of Peterson Manufacturing for the first time as a regular worker. The contrast hit him like a physical blow. While the executive offices on the 15th floor featured marble floors, mahogany furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the worker entrance was a cramped, poorly lit hallway with peeling paint, broken ceiling tiles, and the persistent smell of industrial chemicals. The security checkpoint was manned by a guard who looked like he hadn't slept in days. He barely glanced at David's forged documents, social security card, driver's license, previous employment records before waving him through with a board report to shift supervisor Williams in Bay 3. No background check, no safety orientation, no welcome packet. Just a mumbled direction to find someone named Williams. As David made his way through the factory floor for the first time from ground level, the assault on his senses was overwhelming. The deafening roar of machinery that never stopped. The harsh glare of fluorescent lights that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. The heat that seemed to radiate from every surface, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Workers moved like ghosts between the assembly lines, their faces hidden behind safety masks and goggles. But even through their protective gear, David could see something that made his stomach turn: fear. These weren't the confident, skilled craftsmen he'd imagined working in his factory. These were people who moved with the cautious, calculated steps of those who knew that one mistake could cost them everything. "You Martinez," a voice barked behind him. David turned to see a man in his early 50s with the build of someone who'd spent decades working with heavy machinery. His name tag read Williams, shift supervisor, but his eyes held a coldness that immediately put David on edge. This wasn't the face of someone who cared about the people under his command. "Yes, sir." Jake Martinez, ready to work. Williams looked him up and down with obvious disdain, like he was inspecting a piece of defective equipment. "Let me guess, another guy who thinks factory work is easy money because you swing a hammer for a living. Most of you construction tong don't make it past the first week." He shoved a clipboard with forms into David's hands. "Fill these out. You'll be starting in sanitation, night shift cleanup. $11.50 an hour, no benefits until you've been here 6 months. If you last that long, which most don't." David bit back his immediate response. The corporate minimum wage policy he'd personally signed clearly stated starting wages of $15 an hour with benefits available after 90 days. But he forced himself to nod and take the clipboard. "One more thing," Williams added, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper as he stepped closer. "We don't tolerate troublemakers here. Keep your mouth shut, do your job, and maybe you'll keep it. Ask too many questions, complain about the work, or cause any problems with the other workers, and you'll be gone before your first paycheck clears." The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd made it many times before. As Williams walked away, David felt the first chill of realization. This wasn't just poor management or a supervisor having a bad day. This was systematic intimidation designed to keep workers silent and compliant. The sanitation assignment led David to the factory's basement level, a maze of storage rooms, utility corridors, and maintenance areas that felt like the building's forgotten underworld. The area was dimly lit with flickering fluorescent bulbs, exposed pipes that dripped condensation, and the constant smell of industrial chemicals that made his eyes water. It was here, in this forgotten corner of his own company, at 2:47 a.m., that David heard the sound that would change everything, someone crying quietly behind a supply closet door. David approached carefully, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Through the thin door, he could hear someone sobbing with the kind of desperate, hopeless sound that comes from complete despair. It was the cry of someone who had reached their breaking point but couldn't afford to break. He knocked gently on the door. "Hey, are you okay in there?" The crying stopped immediately, like someone had flipped a switch. He heard shuffling footsteps, the sound of someone trying to compose themselves, wiping away tears and preparing to face the world again. I'm fine. Just give me a minute." But the voice wasn't fine. It was shattered, held together by nothing but desperate necessity. When the door finally opened, David saw a woman in her late 40s wearing a maintenance uniform that was 3 sizes too big for her small frame. Her name tag read Rosa Delgado, Night Sanitation, and her employee ID photo showed a woman who had once smiled. The person standing before him now looked like she hadn't smiled in years. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and her hands shook as she tried to compose herself. But it was something else that made David's blood run cold, the angry red chemical burns that covered her arms from her wrists to her elbows. "Sorry," she whispered, not making eye contact. "I shouldn't be. I need to get back to work. Mr. Williams checks on us." "Those burns look serious," David said, genuinely concerned. "When did that happen?" Rosa glanced around nervously, like she was afraid someone might be listening. "The chemicals they're making us use, they're not the ones from the safety manual. Mr. Williams says we have to use the industrial-grade cleaners to save the company money, but they burn through skin." She held up her hands, and David could see that the chemical burns weren't just on her arms. They covered her palms and fingers, making every movement obviously painful. "I asked about the safety gloves we're supposed to have, the ones shown in the training videos," Rosa continued, her voice barely audible. "But Mr. Williams said if I couldn't handle the job without complaining about every little thing, plenty of people would be happy to take my position." David felt his jaw clench. The company safety regulations he'd personally reviewed and approved were crystal clear. All cleaning chemicals had to be OSHA approved, and protective equipment wasn't optional, it was mandatory. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, though he could already guess the answer would make him angry. 8 years. Never missed a day. Never been late. Never had a single complaint on my record." Rosa's voice carried a pride that made David's heart ache. This was someone who took genuine pride in her work, who showed up every day ready to do her best despite being treated terribly. But lately, everything's been changing. "They cut our hours but increased our workload. We're supposed to clean the same square footage with half the staff and these chemicals that ... She gestured helplessly at her burned arms. Rosa looked around again, then leaned closer and lowered her voice even further. "My daughter Elena, she's in her 2nd year at college, pre-med. She wants to be a doctor, help people." For a moment, Rosa's eyes lit up with maternal pride. "I've been working double shifts, picking up extra hours wherever I can to pay her tuition, but with the ER cuts ... Her voice broke again, and David watched as the weight of impossible circumstances crushed down on her. "I don't know how I'm going to tell her. She might have to drop out. She's so smart, so dedicated. She's everything I never got to be, and now ... double quotes. Rosa couldn't finish the sentence. David watched as she pinned her name badge back onto her oversized uniform with hands that were visibly damaged from chemical exposure. That small silver rectangle, Rosa Delgado, night sanitation, represented everything to her. Her daughter's medical school dreams, their rent money, their health insurance, their survival. And someone was systematically destroying it for profit. David spent the rest of that shift observing, taking mental notes, and slowly building a picture of systematic abuse that made him sick to his stomach. But he knew that what he'd seen so far was just the surface. The next day, operating from his CEO office but carefully avoiding any inquiries that might tip off the wrong people, David began his own investigation. What he found in the corporate databases made his hands shake with rage. Williams had been flagged 3 times in the past year for safety violations, but somehow those reports had been buried in administrative paperwork and never made it to upper management. Even worse, the budget allocations for safety equipment and proper cleaning supplies had been approved and funded by the board. David himself had signed off on $50,000 for the Detroit facility alone. But that money had disappeared into vague administrative costs and efficiency improvements. Someone wasn't just cutting corners to save money. Someone was stealing safety funds while workers like Rosa suffered chemical burns. But David needed more evidence before he could act. That evening, he returned to the factory as Jake Martinez, but this time he came prepared with a small recording device and a hidden camera, both perfectly legal under the company's own employee surveillance policies that he'd ironically approved years earlier. Rosa was already there when he arrived, her cart loaded with the same unlabeled chemical containers that had burned her skin. When she saw David, she managed a weak smile. "You came back," she said, and he could hear genuine surprise in her voice. "Most people don't last 2 nights down here. The chemicals, the hours, Mr. Williams ... it's too much." "Told you I needed the job," David replied, moving closer to examine her supply cart. What he saw made his anger spike even higher. The chemical containers had no proper labeling, no OSHA safety data sheets, just crude handwritten notes that said general cleaner and heavy duty, but David could smell the harsh, acrid fumes from 3 feet away. These were clearly industrial solvents, the kind used in manufacturing processes, not routine cleaning. The kind that required respirators and full protective gear. "Rosa, where do these chemicals come from? I've worked cleanup before, and I've never seen anything like this." She glanced around nervously, always watching for Williams before answering. "Mr. Williams gets them from some supplier downtown. Says they're just as good as the expensive OSHA stuff, but they cost the company half as much. Corporate gets to save money on the budget, and Williams gets a bonus for keeping costs down." David felt his anger building like a pressure cooker. The expensive OSHA stuff Rosa mentioned weren't luxury items, they were the legally required, safely tested chemicals his company was obligated to provide. Williams was poisoning workers to pad his performance reviews. And the safety equipment, gloves, masks, protective gear. Rosa's expression darkened. "We haven't had proper gloves or masks in 3 months. Williams says the orders keep getting delayed by the purchasing department, but ... double quotes. She hesitated, then decided to trust this new worker who seemed to actually care. "Yesterday I was cleaning near his office and I heard him on the phone. He wasn't ordering safety equipment. He was talking to someone about selling our protective gear to another company. Making money on equipment that was supposed to protect us." The pieces were forming a picture of systematic theft and worker endangerment that reached far beyond one rogue supervisor. Williams wasn't just cutting corners, he was actively stealing safety equipment and selling it while workers suffered preventable injuries. At 11:30 p.m., Williams made his first patrol of the night, strutting through the basement area like he was surveying his personal kingdom. His eyes scanned for any sign of workers not meeting his impossible standards, looking for reasons to intimidate and punish. "Delgado." His voice echoed through the corridor like a whip crack. "This area's still dirty. What the hell have you been doing for the past hour and a half?" David watched Rosa's shoulders tense as Williams approached. The floor she'd been cleaning was spotless. David could literally see his reflection in the polished concrete. But Williams wasn't interested in actual cleanliness. He was interested in maintaining control through fear. "I'm sorry, Mr. Williams. I'll go over it again." "You better. And next time, maybe try actually working instead of gossiping with the new guy." Williams' eyes turned to David with obvious hostility. "Martinez, right? Let me make something crystal clear. I don't care what sob story brought you here or what kind of work you think you're used to. You work at my pace, you follow my rules exactly, or you're gone." Williams pulled out a clipboard and made a theatrical show of writing notes. "I'm docking both of you 30 minutes from tonight's timesheet for inefficiency and excessive socializing. Maybe that'll motivate you to focus on work instead of chit-chat." David watched in horror as Williams calmly committed wage theft right in front of him. 30 minutes each, an hour of wages stolen with the casual cruelty of someone who knew his victims couldn't fight back. But the most sickening part was watching Rosa simply nod and accept it, too frightened and desperate to protest. After Williams left, continuing his patrol like a prison guard, David turned to Rosa. "He can't just steal your pay like that. There are labor laws, federal regulations." "Labor laws are for people who can afford lawyers," Rosa interrupted, her voice carrying years of bitter experience. "People like me. We don't have lawyers. We don't have unions. We don't have anyone who cares what happens to us. We just try to survive day by day and hope we can keep our jobs long enough to pay the bills." She gestured toward a bulletin board covered with work schedules and official-looking company notices. David walked over to examine it more closely and felt his stomach drop to his shoes. The schedule was a nightmare of chaos and manipulation. Crossed-out shifts, arbitrarily reduced hours, and impossible workloads assigned to skeleton crews. But worse than the schedule itself were the official notices posted alongside it. New efficiency standards, effective immediately. Mandatory overtime policy changes, no exceptions. Safety equipment updates, budget constraints. Disciplinary action guidelines, zero tolerance. All of them were signed by Williams and backdated to make them look like legitimate corporate policies. But David knew every real policy that came from corporate headquarters, and none of these existed in the company manual. "Rosa, these notices, these policy changes. They're not real company policies, are they?" She shook her head sadly. "Williams makes up his own rules as he goes along. Says everything comes directly from corporate management, but we never see official documentation, never get copies for our files. And if anyone questions it or asks to see the real policies... She made a throat-cutting gesture. David photographed everything with his hidden camera, documenting evidence of systematic fraud, wage theft, and worker intimidation. But he had a growing suspicion that Williams wasn't operating alone. This level of organized deception suggested someone higher up the corporate ladder was involved. At 1 a.m., Williams disappeared into his office for what Rosa had mentioned were his regular midnight meetings. Through the frosted glass partition, David could see Williams hunched over his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones. "Who does he talk to during these late-night calls?" David asked. Rosa glanced around nervously, then whispered, "Nobody knows for sure, but Tommy from day shift maintenance thinks it's someone from corporate headquarters. Someone high up who helps Williams get away with everything he does down here." The implication hit David like a physical blow to the chest. This wasn't just one corrupt supervisor operating in isolation. This was an organized conspiracy that potentially reached into the upper levels of his own company. Someone in corporate headquarters was not only aware of Williams' illegal activities but actively supporting them. David made a decision that would either expose the truth or destroy his carefully constructed cover. "Rosa, I need you to trust me completely. Can you get me access to Williams' office? I think there's something in there we need to see." Rosa stared at him like he just suggested they rob a bank at gunpoint. "Are you completely insane? If Williams catches us in his office, we'll both be fired on the spot. Or worse, he might call the police, claim we were stealing. What if I told you that what we find in there might help not just you, but every worker in this factory? Every person who's been cheated, threatened, or poisoned?" Something in David's voice, some quality of absolute conviction, must have reached her. After a long moment of internal struggle, Rosa nodded slowly. "There's a master key ring in the maintenance supervisor's office. I could get it during my regular cleaning rounds, but Jake, if we're caught, if this goes wrong... double quotes, it won't go wrong. And if somehow it does, I promise you won't face the consequences alone, you have my word. At 1:45 a.m., while Williams was deep in his mysterious phone conversation, David and Rosa slipped into his office using the master key. What they found there would expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond one factory and one corrupt supervisor. Williams' desk was covered with invoices, purchase orders, and financial documents that at first glance looked legitimate. But as David examined them more closely in the dim light from Williams' computer screen, he realized they were all fraudulent. Safety equipment orders for gear that had never been delivered. Chemical purchases from suppliers that didn't exist. Payroll records showing ghost employees. People being paid for work they never did at a factory they never visited. But the real smoking gun was on Williams' computer. David quickly accessed Williams' email system, finding it unlocked and logged in. What he discovered there made his hands shake with a combination of rage and disbelief. Email after email between Williams and someone identified only as our Morrison in the company directory. The correspondence went back over 2 years and detailed exactly how to manipulate safety budgets, hide OSHA violations from federal inspectors, and systematically intimidate workers into silence. But it wasn't just this factory. The email chain referenced for other Peterson manufacturing facilities where identical schemes were being operated by different supervisors, all reporting to the same mysterious R. Morrison. The most damning email was dated just 3 days earlier. Williams, the CEO's been asking uncomfortable questions about worker satisfaction scores and accident rates. Make sure all problem employees are dealt with permanently before any corporate investigators show up. Use whatever methods are necessary to ensure silence. The performance bonuses we discussed for this quarter depend entirely on keeping these operations invisible to upper management, R. Morrison. David's vision went red as he read and reread the email. Someone in his own executive team was orchestrating systematic abuse of workers across multiple facilities, and they were paying supervisors like Williams bonuses to torture people like Rosa into silence. As David photographed the evidence with shaking hands, Rosa stood watch by the door. But then she whispered urgently, "Someone's coming down the hallway." They quickly shut down the computer and slipped out of the office, David pocketing several of the most damaging documents as they escaped. Just as they closed the door behind them, footsteps echoed down the corridor, Williams returning from his phone call, looking more agitated and aggressive than usual. Back at their cleaning stations, David's mind raced with the implications of what they'd discovered. He had documented evidence of fraud, systematic safety violations, wage theft, and worker intimidation. But more importantly, he had proof that this corruption reached into the highest levels of Peterson manufacturing. The question burning in his mind was simple but terrifying: who was R. Morrison, and how many other workers across his company were suffering while his own executives profited from their misery? The answer would come sooner than expected, and it would force David to confront the possibility that the company he'd built had become something monstrous.